I'm Abby Fordham, and I'm really happy to welcome you to today's webinar focusing on our new Pearson English Express Test. We're going to explore how scoring works for the test and how you can set the right score for your institution. If you're just getting familiar with our new test or perhaps looking to fine-tune your admissions guidance, you are in the right place. So this session builds on our last webinar, which was an introduction to Pearson English Express Test, which was hosted by our very own Meredith Stokes, who's on the call. If you missed it, no worries. We do have a recording that we can share with you, and I would definitely recommend it as a great starting point. So today we are joined by David Booth, Pearson's Test Development Director, who will walk us through the scoring side of things. We've also got, like I say, Meredith, our English Assessments Manager, and Tiago, our Product Manager for Pearson English Express Test, here on the line too, ready to help answer your questions during the Q&A or in the chat. So feel free to pop those in as we go. So let's begin. Yeah, let's get started. Dive into the topic of scoring. Over to you, David.
Yes, hi everybody. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are. As Abby said, this is part of a series of seminars that we are running talking about the English Express Test. This particular seminar, we're looking at the science of scoring. So I will be going into some technical details about how the test is scored, which should be useful to a wide range of people in the audience, and should help people, as Abby said, in terms of selecting scores for different programs, as is required by institutions who are taking in students, particularly looking at their English language level.
Quite a lot of thought goes into setting scores and how we advise people in terms of where those scores should be set. What I want to do today is just go and look a little bit under the hood, look at the science behind that and how we kind of come to those scores and why those scores are meaningful, because I think that's something that we all need to consider. So apologies if some of the kind of content in the questions might come over as a little bit simplistic, but I wanted to really get back to the kind of the basics behind this kind of, in inverted commas, science of setting scores. So, when we are thinking about setting scores, I think one of the fundamental questions that we have to ask ourselves is what is language assessment and what is language? We're asking for people to get to a certain standard in terms of, in many cases, English language proficiency, although it's not always English language proficiency. And so if we're asking people to get to that certain standard, what do we really mean by language assessment? Now, things I'm going to go through here kind of underpin a wide range of principles that we follow when we're developing language assessments at Pearson. And these are the principles that underlie the development of the Express Test. So when you're thinking about a language assessment, you have to have in mind a theory of language, because obviously you're testing something, but you have to understand, well, what is it exactly that I'm testing? And for those of you who know about the history of language assessment and the history of language teaching, you will know that over the last 50 or 60 years, ideas about what makes up language have changed, and the focus now in the 2020s is certainly not the focus that it was, for example, in the 1950s and 1960s. So underpinning most people's idea of language is that it's a system for communication. And it's not just a function of the brain. We're going to come on to that in a minute, but also obviously it has a social purpose. And that is also quite critical to the way that we understand language and the way that we test language. So for this, if we're thinking that language is for communication and it's a social tool, then the primacy, the most important element of language is actually interaction or speaking and listening, being able to interact with another person effectively. And, therefore that comes both through the idea of communication and also language as a social tool as well. So we'll reflect on that and we'll look at that in the next couple of slides about, well, what do we mean by a theory of language and what do we mean by communication? But language assessment is also about measurement, and this is quite critical. So whilst it's important to have your theory of language and understand what you're measuring, you have to also have a theory of measurement. So we have to have a way of thinking, well, language is a psychological phenomena. So how are we measuring that phenomena? So this is something, it's intangible. You can't see it. You can hear it, as you're hearing me today. You can read it. You can listen to it. But language itself and language ability is an innate psychological phenomena. So how do you measure that? And what is that made up of? Now, people will think, well, language is made up of listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Well, is it? I mean, what is listening? So if you want to go into the theory of measurement, what are you measuring when you're measuring listening? So many people, and the good answer is actually, and we'll come on to this as well, listening comprehension, that you understand what you hear. That is quite a good measure of the listening skill. What about speaking? So obviously speaking it's not about comprehension. It's about what? It's about pronunciation. It's about fluency. It's about being understood. And all of those things make up the idea of speaking. So when we're looking at the theory of measurement, we should be looking at, well, what are we trying to measure that tells us about somebody's ability to speak and tells us about somebody's ability to listen or to read or to write? Okay, so what are those? And I've got it on this slide. What are those traits? What are those individual elements of language that allow us to measure how well a person can actually function in the language? So what are the fundamental principles that we can debate, and I'm sure linguists and others will debate, is that that these abilities can be measured. We can measure these traits, and we can therefore come up with numbers. In the science of scoring, we can come up with numbers which are meaningful and which represent somebody's ability to speak in a language, to listen and to understand, to read a language, and also to write. So language assessment combines this theory of language and the theory of measurement. And then we have this language assessment, the assessment of proficiency, the ability to use language. And this is quite, this may sound like, just words, but, the ability, language ability, proficiency to use language. So it's not just knowledge, it's also use, okay? And the other thing that's important in language assessment is, of course, it's a psychological thing we're measuring. So you cannot be exact. Everything in language proficiency and language proficiency measurement is an estimate. So when we say that this is a score and this is the score that somebody gets, it's an estimate of their language ability. So why are we doing this? So what's the purpose of doing and there are different purposes in doing language assessment. There are different reasons why you might want to do language assessment, and I must not claim too much in the next quote because I just took it from the AI on Google. But the primary purpose of language assessment is to evaluate an individual's language proficiency. Fine, we got that. Which can inform decisions. Now, this is the slightly different. This is the kind of why. Can inform decisions about learning, placement, and even broader societal context. It helps determine a learner's strengths and weaknesses. tracks progress, guides instruction. So, of course, the reasons behind language assessment can be many, but the primary purpose of Pearson English Express Test and the primary purpose of tests similar to Pearson English Express Test is to place a learner in a course or place somebody on a particular point on the language learning continuum, so that you know whether or not they're suitable as an applicant for a particular course of study. So one of the main purposes of language testing, and the purpose that we're talking about today, is to put that person, to place that person in an appropriate course. But there's still kind of questions in terms of some of the terminology that we mean. So we're talking about language proficiency. So what do we mean by proficiency? Okay, so there are two main elements to proficiency. One is, how much do you know? And the other one is, how well can you use what you know? So there's a quantity, an amount, and if you think in terms of language, it could just be vocabulary. We're just talking about a person's vocabulary. How much vocabulary do they know? And we all know that learners at high levels of proficiency have a larger vocabulary, a larger accessible vocabulary. However, how they use that vocabulary can vary quite a lot in terms of how they use it in spoken, or how they use it in a written form, or how they use it when they're listening or when they're reading. So they may the innate knowledge may be there, but there's also this element of quality. How well can you use what you know? And those are two of the main constructs that underline language proficiency. Now, today we're going to talk quite a lot, or I'm going to put up some slides which look at the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. Now, this is a kind of body of work that's been put together primarily by European scholars. There was Swiss, Dutch, English, based in various universities in Europe. A set of schools, University of Cambridge are involved, and other academics, Dutch academics as well. And in fact, it was a Europe-wide panel of experts who came up with this framework. And one of the underlying principles behind the Common European Framework is the fact that it's communicative. So it's about what you can do with language. So it's not a description of the grammar. It's not a description of vocabulary. There are associated texts which have lists of vocabulary that go with this, but the purpose of the actual framework is to describe language ability in terms of what people can do. So it's what they call action or outcome orientated. It's what you can do with the language that's important, not that necessarily that innate ability. And these can-do statements, or statements about what people can do, are expressed in these terms. Now, you can look at these and you can say, well, this is describing, for example, what somebody can do in this what's called B1 plus, which is a kind of mid-intermediate type level. So these are the things that a person should be able to do. Now, again, we have this quantity and quality aspect. So yes, you can do it, but how well can you do it? And underlying the mathematics and the science behind, there is actually an answer to that in scientific terms, because these scales, as I say, are estimates, and they're based around probability. So it's whether you have a 50% chance of being successful at that particular measure or that particular can-do statement that would say that you were then at that level or not. So there is underneath these numbers, 51, this is 51, there is a science in terms of putting these numbers on that scale. So the scale is not arbitrary. The scale is determined through, actually, in this case, these can-do statements were rated by teachers and rated by other experts, and that was used to put them on this actual scale. So the can-do statements are important because from a testing perspective, they tell you what people should be able to do at different levels, and it's communicative. And from a learning perspective, it tells you what people should be learning at those levels in order to get mastery at a particular level. So sometimes these are called can-do statements. What can you do? Sometimes they call learning objectives. What do you need to learn? But it's the same principle behind them. But that's one element of language. That's the description and the communicative description of outcomes. When we're looking at measuring language, as I said before, we've got to look at measuring the psychological traits that underpin that use of language. And as we were talking about, these traits often relate to the skills that we recognize, the 4 skills that we recognize, that make up what we commonly think of as language proficiency. But underpinning those skills are these traits. So, for example, pronunciation, fluency, intelligibility, how well can I be understood? Accuracy, we all understand accuracy, grammatical or vocabulary accuracy. Appropriacy, am I using the right word in the right way? Is the content that I'm producing appropriate? So, for example, if I'm asked a question on a particular subject, is the answer that I give relevant to that question that I've been asked? Similarly, particularly when we're looking at the traits that underpin writing skills, you know, is the grammar appropriate? Again, there's an element of accuracy, but also an element of range. Is the grammatical range at the level that we expect for that particular test taker? Is the vocabulary that they're using at that level? Can a test taker organize their writing in an appropriate way? Do they give it the appropriate voice? Is it the speaker's voice that they're adopting? Is that appropriate for the context that they're using? And do they know the conventions of writing a particular task? If it's an email task or if it's a summary task, do they understand what the conventions are in terms of writing those particular answers to those tasks? So these are really the basis for the measurement of the test taker who's taking the test. So the context is communicative. What they're being asked to do is communicative. And one thing I didn't point out, see if I can just go back a couple of slides. Sorry, Paul. Oh dear, apologies. No, I was trying to go back. Here we go. Yes, what I didn't point out here, which I should have done, if you can look at these can-do statements, there are 3 of them which are marked AC, okay? And that means these are academic in nature. So we're looking at listening skills here at a kind of a mid-intermediate level, and some of these are just general English kind of things that people need to do with language in general context, but some of them also relate to academic contexts. So it's not, the context is important, and the context is defined in many ways by those can-do statements. And the psychometric measurement, so the measurement of the psychological traits, focuses on these areas to see whether or not the test taker has the appropriate psychological processes and ability to produce the language appropriately in those contexts that are described by those can-do statements. So quite quickly, I'd like to just go through some of the test items. Now, I think in the previous seminar, the focus has been on the test and what's in the test. I'm not necessarily focused on that particularly, but to understand the kind of science of the scoring, we need to have a little look at the items as well. So I'll just run through quickly some of the items, and I'm mainly focused here on the speaking element of the test. As I said, speaking is the primary skill. Now, we could look at reading, we could look at writing, and there will be differences in terms of the science of that scoring because they're based around different traits. But just for exemplification, I really want to talk about speaking and listening to an extent. So when we look at the types of questions that the test taker is faced with in the test, then they are relatively simple in their format, but they are more complex in terms of how they're assessed. So, for example, one of the questions on the test is repeat the sentence. Okay, so all the test takers has to do is hear a sentence and repeat it. Now, a lot of information can be gleaned from that. And the sentences are different lengths. They get slightly harder as you go through the test. We take a number of these because they're quite quick and relatively easy to do. But a lot of information can be gleaned from that question in terms of the test taker's ability to listen and speak. Similarly, another question format is build a sentence. Now here, the test taker gets some parts of a sentence and they have to recombine them in order to produce something which is grammatically correct and in the correct order. So again, from the test taker's perspective, it is relatively straightforward. They have three parts of a sentence that they have to recombine to make into a sentence. Again, a lot of information is collected there on the test taker's ability to process that information, process it in real time, and also to produce that sentence to the best of their ability. So we can get an idea of their listening competence and their speaking competence through this particular question. More complex, so those questions are atomistic in a way, they're quite straightforward and simple, but we also combine them in the test with longer questions where people have to listen more intently, process more information, and summarize. So in this particular question, they hear a discussion between three people, and they have to listen carefully to that discussion, get the main ideas from that, so get the overall ideas and some of the main ideas. So it's primarily gist that they're focused on. They're picking out the main details that the three speakers say, and then they have to summarize that in their own words. So quite a demanding task in some ways. Takes listening skills and speaking skills to be able to understand, summarize, and this very useful. We get a lot of feedback from both teachers and students about this, and very useful in that academic context. If they, either in a seminar or just listening to a lecture or just listening to other students speaking and trying to work out, well, what are they talking about? What is it that what's the points they're trying to make? So we have this mixture between the longer tasks and the shorter tasks, but the focus again is primarily on the ability to understand and the ability to produce language which is appropriate, which has appropriate pronunciation, fluency, and is also comprehensible. Another question on the test is give your opinion. And again, so this is asking for people to extend. Again, it's a more extended piece of speaking. People are asked to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of something, or the preferences, similarities, or differences. They get a few different types of these questions. And again, this is an opportunity for the test taker to see if they can convey their ideas logically, how they organize their ideas, the range of grammar and vocabulary and accuracy. So there's quite a lot going on in terms of asking the test taker to give an extended piece of speaking, and again from that we can glean quite a lot of information. For listening, there's another task which involves people listening to a particular example, audio example, listening to a bit of speech, and then writing that down. Okay, so this is like a dictation type item, which is, from a scoring perspective, is a very good way of evaluating the extent to which a person can hear particular phonemes, particular sounds, how accurate is their listening skill in terms of not necessarily comprehension of meaning, although you must have meaning here. You need to understand what the sentence means, actually, in order to write it down. And there's various studies on that. I won't go into it here. There are various studies on that and about how, without understanding, certainly the longer the sentence gets, some people claim that, I could speak in Russian now, and you could write down the Russian that I spoke, but I honestly don't think that's the case. So you need to understand what the sentence means, and particularly as the longer the sentence goes, you've got to hold that in your short-term memory, and it's a very good way of testing a person's how accurate a person can hear those individual sounds and individual words. But again, we want to have something longer. And of course, as I mentioned earlier in the talk, listening comprehension is a major element and a major skill in listening. So we have questions which focus primarily on the test taker listening to a passage with specific information in that passage and trying to pull that out. Again, this is a very important skill for anybody in an academic context, or in any context really, where you've got to understand, what the other speaker says, and also understand that in quite some detail. And obviously these questions vary in terms of difficulty. Some are at that intermediate, low intermediate, some are kind of mid intermediate, some are high intermediate. So you can set the questions at different levels and see whether the test taker can answer those. So the purpose, those are the main questions in terms of speaking and writing. Sorry, speaking and listening. And the purpose is, to elicit those responses from test takers so that we can evaluate the traits, how well they are using the language in the context, in the communicative context that we've set in those questions. So as I said there, repeat the sentence, build a sentence, listen and select answers, which is the listening one. Give your opinion, write what you hear, summarize group discussion. These are the main items, the main tasks which are focused on speaking and listening skills. And you can see for each of those, there's a number of questions in the test, to 10 to 12, 8 to 10. So depending on the length of those questions, we generate more and more information through having a number of those questions actually on the test. And that helps us really in terms of the accuracy of the scores, as people will know from their own experience. If the more good questions you have, the more accurate your scoring will be. If you've got poor questions, it doesn't matter. But if you've got good questions, and the more good ones you've got, then the more accurate you can be in estimating somebody's language ability. Now, that's part of the process. So, in terms of those items and those items that are in the test, they have to go through a strict process in terms of quality control. As I said, having poor items in a test doesn't benefit anybody. If the item's too easy, or if it's multiple choice and the distractors are not very good, if it's got negative discrimination, where poor students get it right and better students get it wrong, tricksy questions. Oh, I'll ask some people. Oh, I'll ask a tricky question. Pointless. These are all pointless. You must have high quality questions that you give the test taker, and those will give you the most accurate results. So the items that we use in PECS, some of them originated in a couple of other Versant tests, Versant English Placement Test and Versant Writing Test. So these were already items in existence. They'd already been trialed and tested on a wide range of students. So we knew that these items worked well. All the items we've subsequently written and put into the PECS test, all of these are written to a detailed test specification and also tagged to specific learning objectives. So we make sure that all the items relate back to the Common European Framework learning objectives. We're trying to test certain elements. As I said, you could call it a can-do statement, you could call it a learning objective, but we're trying to test elements of the language that appear at those different levels. And by tagging the item back through to the framework, then we have a clear idea about where that item sits. I mean, that's only part of the measurement model. And what we have to do, we have an idea about where it sits, but we have to pre-test and we continue to pre-test items to make sure that we know exactly how difficult that is. So pre-testing involves students taking the test, taking the items. We know the level of the students. We know the level of some of the items, and from that we can calculate the level of the other items in the test. So we do that before we have live students taking the test. Pre-testing happens before a paid test taker will sit down and take the test. So these are in trial conditions to make sure that we know how well that item measures. Okay, and these are not just estimates generated by machine. They're estimates which are generated by the feedback and the answers that real test takers give us. So we know actually not from some AI machine saying, oh, it's this level. We know from actual data that we have collected that if we look at the test taker data, we can see that the item is actually at this level. So it's a much more accurate representation of the actual difficulty of the item by using this pre-testing. And also you've got, again, a machine will say, oh, it's this level, but how do you know? We have to test using the test population. So our recent pre-testing, we had over 7,000 participants from all over the world, because that's where the test takers come from. The test takers come from South Asia, Southeast Asia, Latin America, East Asia, Europe. That's where the test takers are. So we have to use those test takers in our samples. Now, as I said, this is the deepest we'll get into the actual scoring. So we went through those different question types, and these question types within our scoring system, basically they model onto a scoring algorithm. So and these scoring algorithms are trained using that information from the students who are doing the pretest. So we are taking those answers that the students give us, and then we're training up these scoring models so they replicate good scoring, efficient and effective and accurate scoring of those particular traits. So you can see here, this scoring algorithm, these items all feed into the scoring algorithm of pronunciation. The other items as well all feed into the scoring algorithm of fluency. So how well individual sounds are pronounced, fluency in terms of the speed in which a test taker speaks, whether they have pauses, filled or unfilled pauses, whether they can be understood, intelligibility, that's another scoring algorithm, how accurate their answers are, so errors with grammatical errors that exist within their speech, appropriacy of language, so language use, and also the content of what they say, whether that's relevant or not. So all of these parameters are measured within those items. So it's not just one measurement of how well did you repeat that sentence. From that repeat sentence item, and there are 10 to 12 of those on the test, we can get information about pronunciation. We can get information about fluency. Okay. We can also get information about intelligibility. So how the person is actually speaking and their ability to speak. We have a lot of information from those different items. But also we can look at accuracy, we can look at appropriacy, and we can look at content. And these have different weightings, and those weightings again come from our understanding of the pre-testing and how the pre-testing worked and which of the different elements are important in making up the speaking skill. And then speaking as a whole on the Express test, Pearson English Express test, makes up 25% of the overall skill. So speaking is 25, listening is 25, reading is 25, and writing is 25. So whilst within the scoring itself, there's a different balance between those different areas. You can see pronunciation, fluency, intelligibility, those kind of, language, those measures of the actual language that's being produced. That's making up about 40% of the overall speaking score. And so once we've got those scores, though, we have to go back and relate it back to the Common European Framework. We have to relate it back to the meaningful, what those scores actually mean. So we do a standard setting exercise. We recruited, I just missed that off, we recruited 10 raters. We had 380 test taker samples. Those are rated by the raters in terms of what they think the test taker's ability were in terms of that framework. Each test taker is rated twice, and then we get an idea of where they are on the Common European Framework. And that then helps us translate those scores into the scores that the test taker needs to get into those particular institutions. So where they are on the Common European Framework helps us set that score against the requirements of the institutions. So you can see there, for example, there's a score reports from the Express test. They got an overall score, they got a Common European Framework level, and they've got scores for listening, speaking, reading, and writing. All of those coming from those traits that we talked about. That's all part of that speaking score there. We can see this person got 59, which is a kind of intermediate score. I think it's just B2. Yes, they just at the basis of B2, which is a good I'd say a high intermediate, certainly an appropriate level. And there's a description on the score report about what that particular person can do, generally speaking, in the level. And we think this got a score of 59, certainly good enough for undergraduate. Undergraduate, we think it's that kind of mid to high intermediate, 51 to 60. Postgrad can overlap. Some postgrad courses are not necessarily so demanding. So our experience is more in the kind of 57 to 67 area, which again is this B2, top of B1 plus into B2. But if the test taker or the student is really just doing degree preparation and they're not yet into an undergraduate or a graduate program, then we would think at lower levels that somebody in that B1 range could certainly start off on that degree preparation. And different institutions have different ideas about how they would prepare them in terms of whether they need to do extra language courses in order to get them up closer to what's required for the undergraduate performance. So most of our experience in terms of setting scores for entry into higher education tell us that this B2, top of B1, B2 is the area where we find most students, and the area where we find students who have that language ability, which is sufficient for them to study in a higher education institution. So as I say, this for example is the B1 example. So this, in terms of the B1, then its main points deal with most situations, simple connected text, but it's moving. It's at the top of that range. They're getting towards the B2 range, but B1 definitely is for those, generally speaking, even not getting towards the top, is for those people preparing. Top of B1, which is B1 plus or B2, is where people move into a proficiency which is more appropriate for the academic context and higher education, can understand the main ideas of complex texts, can interact with fluency and spontaneity, can provide clear, detailed texts in terms of writing on a range of subjects. So when they start getting into that high B1, this B1 plus, and into the B2, that's when they are getting to that level where they can deal with undergraduate and indeed postgraduate programs with relative ease. And that's the relationship of the Express test with the Common European Framework. So we've got clear definition of levels and clear definition of where the students should be in terms of their scores and how that relates to the scores that are accepted by institutions. Now, of course, different institutions set those scores in different ways, as we talk through those different scores, but some institutions will just go by the overall score. Some institutions will look at, well, is there an element of one of the sub skills, speaking, listening, reading, writing, which are more important. So there's different ways of setting the scores, but we would definitely recommend looking at those Common European framework descriptors and seeing, where you think you need students to be and what skills you think the student needs to be at. So looking at the B1 descriptors and looking at the B2 descriptors. There are also descriptors for speaking, listening, reading, and writing. So those can help you work out, well, exactly where do I think I want to set a score for a particular program, be it an undergraduate or a postgraduate program. And as I say, people use a variety of methods in terms of deciding where they want to have that admissions requirement. Sometimes, with mostly based on the overall, but sometimes with lower cut scores on the actual skills. Okay. Hopefully we covered some interesting points there in terms of scoring and the details of how the scoring takes place on the Express test. I wasn't monitoring the Q&A, but if there've been any outstanding questions, happy to take them. Or Tiago and Meredith may have also already answered some of them in the Q&A.
Thank you, David. It was a great deep dive there, and some really interesting information on the science and the background that underpins the scoring for this test. So we do have some questions in the Q&A section, if we can get to those. So a question from Robin. In assessing comparability, did students achieve comparable CEFR levels on the English Express test and the PTE academic? I wonder if you could take that one.
Yeah, sorry, I think I got the question. So would a student get the same score on the Express test and an academic?
Did they achieve comparable CEFR levels for Express and
yeah, that's a very well crafted question. Yes, because comparable, yes, you'd expect them to be comparable because they were obviously, as I said in the talk, all scores that you get in a test are estimates, but the underlying measurement models are the same. So yeah, you'd expect them to get comparable scores. Yeah.
Thank you. Another one for you, David. How is the CEFR relevant for students globally?
Yeah, I mean the CFR. I mean, it is. I accept it. It started in Europe, but it has had an impact on other parts of the world. So, Japan has developed its own CEJ but is used primarily in its English language learning area. China similarly had developed its own framework, but based on the CEFR. It's got very wide currency in Europe and in South America. So Asia, Europe, South America in particular, and this is where the students come from. So where, this is where students are learning English, and they're actually, generally speaking, quite familiar with these levels if they're coming from those particular backgrounds. So the currency and people talking about things like B1, B1 plus, B2, is relevant for those students who are coming, and often in their school system, they will be asked to get to that particular level. So in many school systems, students are asked to get to graduate with B1 or even graduate with B2, and that's becoming a global currency rather than just a European one.
Thank you. Hopefully that answers your question. I've got one from Meredith here. I would like some specific advice on what scores to set for my programs. How can I go about speaking to someone about this?
So you can send a message to me in the chat privately, or you can send it to me via email, meredith.stokes@pearson.com. I think an easy way to look at setting scores, again, kind of looking at what you would like the descriptors to be, or what you're looking for in your student, and then setting from there, as David just kind of talked through. But you can definitely reach out to our team, and we can help guide your school. We can get together and walk you through that as well. There's another question that I will take, and that is, how does this test compare to the Pearson Levels test? Levels is a placement test, so they're used different in purpose, but I can have somebody get in touch with you on that product. That product doesn't fall under our team, so I don't want to give bad information. So Silvana, I can definitely have somebody connect with you and kind of give you a compare and contrast chart on the two.
Thanks, Meredith. Another question in, will you please share the trait scoring tables for the other 3 skills? Are we able to do that?
Yeah, it's a funny one, because in fact the most secret thing in that presentation is that scoring chart I showed you, and how the different algorithms work against the different skills. So I'm loath to really share that very widely, to be honest with you, because it basically tells you how the test works. Now, I know we're scared sometimes that people will then take it and copy it, and you probably can't copy it. But yeah, that is quite detailed information. But it's just to show, I was trying to demonstrate there, is underpinning all of those different skills, is quite a complex set of measurements that go with those different traits.
No worries. Thank you. Keeping it close to our chest. The little sneak peek for you today. And for Tiago, with an at-home online test, what is being done to make sure we can trust the scores? Are you putting additional security measures in place?
Great questions. Yes, absolutely. So being a fully online test, one of our main foundations of the product is security. So for our initial release, we are preparing a good package of a security layer, which includes things like ID, authenticity checks, AI flags for monitoring the video recording and the audio recording. We will also introduce an approach with the second camera monitoring. So despite the laptop when the test is being taken, we are also introducing the mobile phone, which gives us an additional level of security in terms of the environment of the test being taken. And despite this, we have a robust plan for keeping investing in security features to make sure that we will be the most secure test online.
Thanks, Tiago. There is a final little question in the chat. I came in late. Will the PowerPoint be shared with attendees? Yeah, you will get the recording of this session after it ends through your email, so you should be able to get that back. That is a wrap. Thank you very much for joining us today. Huge thanks to David for sharing his knowledge, and to Meredith and Tiago for the support as well. Thank you again for being here, and we hope to see you at the next one. Have a great day. See you later.
Thanks, everyone.